The historic city of Magdeburg began its life as a trade post on a trade route on the river Elbe. It grew into a wealthy town, eventually becoming the capital of Otto the first Holy Roman Emperor, who was buried after his death in the grounds of the monastery of St. Mauritius and St. Catherine that stood here. In 1207, a Gothic-style cathedral replaced the original Romanesque church of the monastery that had been destroyed by a fire. It is one of the earliest and apparently also one of the tallest Gothic-style cathedrals in Germany. In 1524, Martin Luther preached here as well as in many other churches of Magdeburg. Magdeburg subsequently espoused his teachings and became a bastion of Protestantism until 1631, when Count Tilly, the Marshal of the Catholic League, led an imperialist army that besieged the city. Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, was marching to save the city but had been delayed by negotiations with the Elector of Brandenburg. The city fell to Count Tilly and was burned to the ground. Many of its citizens perished in the sack of the city, but those who had taken refuge in the cathedral had their lives spared. The composers Heinrich Schütz and Michael Praetorius had apparently given sermons here in 1618. The cathedral suffered damage and 3 bombings during the Second World War. The tomb of the first Holy Roman Emperor Otto I and of Queen Editha survived, but the interior of the cathedral had been severely damaged. The walls and surviving monuments were charred by the fires. The cathedral was restored in the 1950s by the communist government of East Germany. The Domplatz, or Cathedral Square, has several stately buildings from the Baroque period, built in the early 18th century in the area of the destroyed monastery of St. Maurice and St. Catherine. The Baroque buildings were destroyed in the Second World War and were rebuilt in the 1950s. The houses on the northern side, opposite the cathedral, house today the Parliament of the state of Saxony-Anhalt. Remains of the chapel of St. Gangolf that had been founded in 1012 on the monastery grounds still stand next to the cathedral. Sankt Petri Kirche, St. Peter's Church, is a Lutheran church built on St. Peter's Mount on the shore of the river Elbe in 1150. The original church was destroyed by the soldiers of Otto IV during a civil war between the houses of the Staffen and the Guelphs that were competing for the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. The present church dates from 1258. It was converted into a Gothic church in the 15th century by Archbishop Albrecht von Querfurt. The church was burned by the army of Count Tilly on the 10th of May, 1631. It was restored only to be destroyed once again during an air raid in January 1945. Its subsequent restoration was completed in 1970. The city walls, facing the river below the church, are the original city walls erected in 1022. The Walloon-Kirche or Walloon Church or Church of St. Augustine was once part of a monastery of the Order of St. Augustine founded here in 1285. The church itself was completed in 1366 as a whole church, that is, in the style with windows along the sides. After the conversion of Magdeburg to Protestantism, the monastery was abandoned and the cloisters fell to ruin. The church itself only survived, having suffered relatively light damage during the sack of Magdeburg in 1631. It was eventually given over to the Walloon community of Magdeburg in 1694. It was severely damaged by the Allied bombings of 1945 and was restored by the communist regime in the 1960s. So oddly, like much else in the city, it was destroyed by Christian nations and rebuilt by an atheist state. The chapel of St. Mary Magdalene was founded in 1315. Like everything else in Magdeburg, it was damaged in the sack of the city during the 30 Years' War and was restored in the 18th century only to be damaged again in the air raids of 1945. It was restored by the communist government of East Germany in the 1960s. The altar-marked Platz, the old marketplace, was the center of the medieval city. It was the center of its bustling commercial life. At the eastern end stands the city hall, which dates from 1713. The original city hall was destroyed, like everything else in the sack of the city during the 30 Years' War. One monument, however, that survived the ravages of war is the monument of the Magdeburg rider, covered in gold leaf. The identity of the Magdeburg rider is unknown. He may be King Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Two maidens are carrying his arms. What is seen here is a very good copy of the original. The original statue, dating from the 13th century, is on display in the Historical Museum of Magdeburg. Lucas Klause, the Hermitage of St. Luke, as it was fancifully called, is a late Gothic building that adjoined the city's medieval fortifications and had incorporated a large bastion, a fortified tower on the side of the walls. Today it houses a museum of the history of science, focusing primarily on two scientific geniuses who lived in Magdeburg in the late 17th century, Otto von Guericke and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. The latter is credited with the invention of the binary system and the first computer, while the former is famous for discovering nothing, or rather for inventing a method to create a vacuum. He succeeded in this quest by building this interesting device that looks somewhat like a bicycle pump and works like one, except that rather than pumping air out of its nozzle, it draws air in through the nozzle, therefore creating a vacuum in anything that is attached into the nozzle. Several copies of Guericke's original vacuum pump are on display alongside the sulfur sphere used to create static electricity. Guericke is indeed usually credited also with the discovery of electricity. Among the many fascinating instruments of early modern science, a device is on display that demonstrates how the vacuum pump was used to create a vacuum inside an enclosed sphere. Goethe, who was also the mayor of Magdeburg, publicly demonstrated in a famous experiment that air has pressure, and that, moreover, air pressure is so high that when the air is pumped out of the sphere so as to create vacuum, horses are unable, for all their strength, to separate the two halves of the sphere, having to work against the effect of air pressure. Parts of the medieval fortification of Magdeburg still survive, between Lucas Klause and the Magdeburg Cathedral, known today as the Fürstenwall, the Prince's Wall. One outdoor exhibit along the Fürstenwall is a demi-cannon from 1669, similar to the cannons that would have been used in the 30 Years' War. Demi-cannon were one of the largest types of cannon of that period in terms of their caliber. They had no elevation screws and were therefore fired only in this position, straight ahead. The length of the barrel of most pieces of artillery of that time was calculated so that a cannon ball, when fired, would hit the ground at approximately 300 meters from the mouth of the gun, what was known as the point-blank range, which was also the range of muskets and therefore the range of engagement of opposing armies. This particular piece, however, would have required a team of a dozen or more horses to be moved around, and was therefore never moved around very much. It was used mostly on ships or as siege artillery. It would have been a cannon such as this one that demolished the gate and towers of the medieval city wall, allowing Count Tilly's army to enter the city in 1631.